very good day to you, and welcome to the Game Changer program, proudly brought to you by the National Transitional Justice Working Group of Zimbabwe. Today, we are going to be commemorating the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances. And of course, we know that on the 18th of December 1992, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a declaration on the protection of all persons from enforced disappearances. The adoption came after the increased reports of cases of enforced disappearances in the world, arrest, detention, and of course, abduction. Cases of enforced disappearances remain unresolved in Zimbabwe, and we have a few cases such as that of Itai Dzamara, a political activist and a critic of the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who was abducted on the 9th of March 2015, and 8 years on, this case still remains unresolved. Today, I have three experts in me, two that are going to be with me in studio and one on Zoom virtually, who are going to be taking us through some of these challenges. What are the challenges, and why do we still have recurring cases of disappearance in Zimbabwe? To join me for this conversation, I have with me Zikamai Bere, who's the National Transitional Justice Working Group Vice Chairperson. I also have with me virtually Dr. Francis Lovemore, who is the National Transitional Justice Working Group Reparations Committee Thematic Leader. And of course, last but not least, I have with me Justina Mukoko, who is the Peace Project, the Zimbabwe Peace Project Director. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Right, I'll start off with Zikamai. Let's talk a little bit about what enforced disappearances mean.
Thank you very much, Unique, for convening this conversation. So, enforced disappearances refers to a situation where an individual or a group of people, let's say technically placed outside the protection of the law.
Right.
So this happens when a person is either arrested, abducted, or detained. And this can usually, a key element of that is it can be the state or institutions of the state or armed or organized groups that are operating either with the direct or indirect assistance, blessings, or support of the state.
Right.
So you're looking at a situation that sometimes it may look like a proper arrest. So people come to your home and they're dressed like police and they take you. But it then becomes enforced disappearance when they deny having you in custody,
Right.
meaning to say your rights are now in danger, or they can come as civilians. So you might know of situations where we have had armed groups, usually associated with the state or the state security apparatus.
Yeah.
So they may not be the police or the military, but they are groups which the police have got the capacity to stop, but they choose to. And that failure to stop that can be interpreted as a blessing of the state,
right,
for these groups to operate at that level. A good example is the detention of the 39 staffers from ZESNI and ERC,
yeah,
when the police were saying we don't have them. So during that space, when the police are saying we don't have them, the individuals, it means they've been placed outside the protection of the law. Hence, it becomes enforced disappearance.
Thank you so much, Zikamai, for at least breaking down what enforced disappearance is, especially for our audience as well. Dr. Francis, I'd like to bring you into this conversation, talking about some of the impacts of the enforced disappearances. What could be the impacts, especially on victims and families of victims of enforced disappearances?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for an opportunity to talk about this. So I think one of the key significant impacts are the fact that it's actually a lifelong trauma, that no matter how much counseling or psychological support you receive, the lifelong anxiety and depression that is caused by an event such as this is almost unresolvable. The other critical thing is that for families whose loved ones have disappeared, the unresolved issue of no closure leads to genuine trauma, both for the immediate family and for the intergenerational trauma. So if you look at, for example, in Chile at the moment, they've just reopened the investigations for the enforced disappearances of over 1,000 people in the 70s. And 50 years later, the families are still deeply traumatized and seeking closure. So I think we can't overemphasize enough the impact of intergenerational trauma and the lifelong trauma that it causes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. I'm talking about generational trauma and the lifelong trauma. Justina, you being the director of the Zimbabwe Peace Project, you're also a victim of enforced disappearance. What sort of impacts did your abduction experience have on you and your family?
I think it came as a shock because you read about these things and you never imagine that you will find yourself in the same situation.
Yeah.
And I think when my family was going through this, I was not there. I was in my own corner, actually not knowing what was happening out there. But I think there was a time that they believed I had been killed because the time had stretched a bit. And from where I was also not sure if I was going to make it alive. Because in my work, I had also documented people who had not made it out. So it caused a lot of shaking of the family, because when you believe that your loved one could have been killed, going out to morgues, looking through bodies, that's also very traumatic. Just going through other people's bodies that are not related to you because you are looking for your loved one. I think that's a very difficult process that my family found themselves in. And I think for me, coming out, I really couldn't believe that I was really out, because there was a time that I thought, I think my grave is being dug outside, because I had been told that I could be buried around the building where they were keeping me. And a few days later, someone was digging outside. And I thought that was the grave that was being dug. And for days, I could not sleep. And I think, like what Dr. Francis has said, the trauma is lifelong.
Yeah.
I think the mention of the word just rekindles everything. And you relive what you went through, because probably people are talking about what someone else is going through. So it's not something that will easily be shaken off. It's a life that I need to get used to. It's like a tree that has been damaged by a storm. It still exists, but I think it's in a different form.
Thank you so much, Justina, for that. Zikamai, we want to sort of get into the brief historical context of the origins of enforced disappearances. I know initially you were saying that this means that these individuals who are victims of enforced disappearances are obviously out now, cannot be protected by the law. And of course, the state will say, look, we don't have these people. So, I mean, they're not protected. When did this all start initially?
Yeah, so the significant move was 1992, when the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances.
Right.
And it is rooted in the right to personal security. which is contained in many constitutions, in the Universal Declaration, in our own African Charter, and in different human rights instruments. And the obligation is on the state to ensure that the human being is protected. Now, the greatest, over history, over a long period of time, the greatest threat to that security has always come from the state itself.
Right.
So we are faced with a situation where the state is supposed to ensure the protection of a human person. Then it carries the responsibility in two ways. One is that it needs to offer that protection, but then also it needs to actively not threaten that protection and that security. So in the run-up to the declaration, there was an increase in incidences where the state, its apparatus, and groups linked to the state or operating with its blessings were violating the right to security. Then in 2010, after a number of human rights groups had been mobilizing, the official day was then set up and agreed by the UN General Assembly. It was formally commemorated in 2011.
Right.
And this year we continue to commemorate that day, looking back at the milestones. The key thing that we use, or the tools that we use, is that actual declaration which came in 1992, which clearly defines what enforced disappearances are, and it helps us identify when an enforced disappearance has happened, and creates obligations on member states. The second key thing associated with that as well is the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, which was then adopted on 20 December in 2006.
Right. So it's quite interesting that despite the many cases of enforced disappearances, Zimbabwe has neither signed nor ratified the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. What does this mean for us as a country?
I think it's an indictment on the state. On the government, which according to our constitution has got an obligation to ensure that citizens enjoy the right to security. But also it speaks to how the state itself has been implicated in violations of this right. And this goes as far back as the Kukurawundi atrocities, the food riots, the Operation Mrambatsvina. So we have had a history in which the institutions of the state that are designed to ensure the security of the human person are actually used to violate the security of the human person. According to the NGO Forum, about 72% of human rights violations that happen in this country are perpetrated by the security apparatus of the state. And that is very telling. In the case of Justina Mkoko, the court found that the state was responsible for her abduction. And there was a finding, there was a judgment, and there was an order for compensation, meaning to say the state officially was convicted. And there are a number of cases that have then been, which shows that the state continues to be unwilling to satisfy its obligations under our constitution. So that explains why I think the state does not want to ratify the convention.
Dr. Francis, just talking a little bit about psychological support, Justina says that it's sort of a lifelong burden that you have to carry with you, and obviously you have to find ways to obviously deal with the trauma and the pain. Are there any psychological support mechanisms for victims of enforced disappearances?
Sorry. So one of the challenges within this country is the failure of the state to recognize the rehabilitation burden that it bears as its responsibility for victims of both organized violence and torture and disappearances. So unfortunately, all support services are within the private sector and the non-state actors. So they're either from the NGOs or from private practitioners, which puts it into quite a difficult category for people to access. And the other challenge is that the people who are victims of enforced disappearances are often stigmatized and kind of isolated from their social bases because of their perceived hostility to state actors. Therefore, they become an extremely difficult category of person to manage safely within a system. So you'll find that no person who's a victim of an enforced disappearance actually wants to attend a government-funded program, although the government-funded programs should be responsible for this. So it's one of the things that we need to seek in the transitional justice process is safe access for all victims of organized violence, torture, and disappearances to government-funded remedies, because it is actually the responsibility of the state. All conventions worldwide demand that the state provides these services. So it is a very complex category of people to manage because they have quite significant issues that are hard to deal with within medical practice.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Well, after a short break, we'll continue this conversation as we look at the significance of commemorating enforced disappearances from a transitional justice point of view, but also looking at how many cases we have in 2023. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Game Changer program, proudly brought to you by the National Transitional Justice Working Group of Zimbabwe. And today we are commemorating the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances. And just before the break, we were getting given a context or, a foundation of what exactly enforced disappearances are, but also speaking to a victim of enforced disappearance and also looking at some psychological impact of this serious challenge that we have within our country. To join me for this conversation, I have with me Zikamai Bere, who's the National Transitional Justice Working Group Vice Chairperson, and Dr. Francis, who's the National Transitional Justice Working Group Reparations Committee Thematic Leader, and of course, Justina Mukoko, who's the Zimbabwe Peace Project Director. Thank you so much for joining us again on the second segment. I want to start off with Justina. Let's look at 2023, Justina, and how many cases of abductions do we know so far?
I would say in the run-up to the elections, there are a few cases that we have heard of.
Right.
We have not concluded in terms of the number of people that have gone through enforced disappearances, because some of the reports are still trickling in. But I also want to say, let's not forget, there is a case that happened a few days ago when a CCC activist was abducted, tortured, and released. And I think in the run-up to the elections, we also saw a number of political activists also being abducted in the same manner, tortured, and then released in some of the cases. So I think when I look at the history of abductions, I think we had the highest number in 2020. I think in that year we had up to 60 cases that we recorded, but for 2023 up to now, we are still tying up the loose ends. But I think the sad bit is that it seems this is something that is still ongoing.
Yeah.
We would have thought getting to this stage, Zimbabwe would have outgrown using enforced disappearances.
Right.
And I think if you speak to anyone who is a human rights activist, who is a political activist, one thing that they are most afraid of is being abducted. No one really minds being arrested by the police and taken to Harare Central Police, because then you are protected within the law,
Yes.
is what Zikamai said earlier on. But when you are outside the confines of the law, anything can happen to you.
Anything can definitely happen to you. But looking at this very important day, Zikamai, what is the link between enforced disappearances and transitional justice?
Yeah, the link comes in because enforced disappearances is classified as a serious human rights violation.
Right.
It is classified as a serious human rights violation because in one violation, you have a wholesale violation of many other rights. So once a person is placed outside the protection of the law, it means they are in danger of anything. So it means their right to life is in danger, freedom from torture is in danger, personal dignity, and all those things. So it creates a combo of human rights violations. That's why it then becomes a transitional justice issue. Because it becomes transitional justice issue. Transitional justice deals with what we call gross violation of human rights. These are violations that go at the heart of mind. That sends a sense of shock in the community, particularly in Zimbabwe, where we are speaking about enforced disappearances. They are part of the systematic or organized crimes that are perpetrated mainly by the state. So it becomes a transitional justice issue, also because of the number of people who have been affected historically, but also who are affected even by one incident. So I spoke about us going back to Gukurahundi, just trying to think how many people were disappeared during that period. We go to the times of the civil unrest, 1998, 1999, 2000, and up to the current times, when people know that once it's election time, people are afraid of that knock on the door. We've got people like the case of Chizuze and all those other individuals who have been disappeared. We have the case of Itai Zamara, who up to now has not been accounted for. And particularly because almost all our cases, they are difficult to resolve. Up to now, we don't know where Itai Zamara is. We don't know where Paul Chizuze is. And there are many individuals whose whereabouts are unknown. And because of that, it becomes what we call a continuing violation. As long as that person is not accounted for, it means the violation continues. It affects, as Dr. Lovemore has mentioned, not only that person, but all the people, their family. Remember, our African Charter and even our Constitution does protect the institution, and it obliges the state to protect the institution of the family. And once the family has been violated in that manner, it means they are all have got the right to know the truth. So it then continues to become a transitional justice issue, because we then have a link with one, the right to security and the right to the truth. And now this right to the truth is not only an individual right, but it's also a community right. The society has got the right to know what has happened to this person. There were 39 observers that were arrested a few days ago. and their families didn't know where they are. Their lawyers didn't know where they are. And the police said, we don't know where they are. Now, you probably have seen the pictures. You're a journalist. You have seen them. You've seen the pictures. There are a lot of young people there, the young women there who were just doing their work as responsible citizens. Imagine, so we had more than 30 families on election day that didn't know where their loved ones. It becomes a wholesale violation of human rights in that aspect.
Yeah. Dr. Francis, I know you need to dash, but last question. I know obviously you speak to some of these victims and obviously you try to help them in the process of them recovering from such trauma. What are these victims saying to you? What is the what are some of the key things that frequently come to you in terms of their hopes and dreams and their fears as well? These specific victims.
So I think the greatest fear is the issue of recurrence. So, if they don't have any access to legal redress or it's not acknowledged by the state, the fear of it recurring or of their family members suffering the same fate is a very real fear. I think another issue is the issue of flashbacks and not sleeping at night. It's extremely difficult to suppress some of these memories, and situations will trigger a flashback, which can have quite serious relationship consequences within a family, and with children, and with the extended process. It affects their work process. It's difficult to be a functional human being when you're deeply fearful of something happening again, and it's a challenge to help people who have been victims to resolve the issues. But more than that, it's a challenge to families who haven't actually found their loved ones to resolve the issues, because there's this, and I spoke about this earlier, the stigmatization of the family by the state and by neighbors, etc. And there is a relationship and trust issue, and your human nature is dependent on relationships and trust, and being able to move through life with some sense of security. When that is removed, you start to have many challenges, and the list is long. But I think that it's one of the big challenges in this, particularly in this country, is that the risk of being abducted for holding a different view to anybody else is reasonable, and it instills a lack of action for people. So yeah, it's not a good space for families and for victims to be in, and it's very difficult to resolve that space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. Justina, talking about ZPP, I know that ZPP has obviously been at the forefront for campaigning for peace in Zimbabwe. How has ZPP been campaigning and fighting against violence and abductions?
What we advocate for is the total elimination of enforced disappearances, because it's untold suffering that citizens go through. We have processes of arrest that the state can use if a citizen has probably has something, if they have something against someone. There are ways and means that they can do it. And I think we have always argued that the problem that we have with our institutions like the police is that they do not investigate and then arrest. What they do is that they will detain and investigate. And during that time when they are investigating, this is when they want this person away from everybody else. And this is when they will tell you that we don't have this person, according themselves more time with that individual who at that particular time is not protected by the law. And we also advocating for government to also ratify the Convention Against Torture. I think it's just the right thing to do when we look at our Bill of Rights, which guarantees the right to human dignity, the right to personal security. So if we continue without these laws that also kind of control institutions of the state, we are really putting people at risk. And I think we continue to say we really want a total elimination of enforced disappearances, because it's not just the victim who goes through a lot of pain, it's the family. Because they have seen other people not coming back. We have already spoken about how no one knows what happened to Itai. And if any family is subjected to a situation where their loved one is enforced and disappeared, they think about these things, that maybe the fate of their loved one could be the same as that of Itai Dzamara. And I think as a nation that aspires to be democratic and hence recognize all the democracy tenets, I think we should actually eliminate enforced disappearances.
Thank you so much, Justina, for that. Well, after the short break, we'll continue in our last segment as we look at some key steps one should take when someone is abducted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the last segment of this Game Changer program, proudly brought to you by the National Transitional Justice Working Group of Zimbabwe. And of course, just to remind you, today we are remembering or commemorating the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances, looking at some key challenges that we have within our country, how many cases we have in 2023, and of course, looking at, what the victims are saying when they're trying to deal with the traumas and challenges, and why this day is so important for us to remember and commemorate. And I think Zikamai, if we're to talk about some of the steps, because I know that we have audiences all over the world and locally who want to know, what do I do if I'm going to be a victim of abduction or disappearance? What steps should one take when one is abducted?
Yeah, so depending with the context, many victims of enforced disappearances are usually persons who are involved in human rights work.
Right.
And I think there are security protocols associating that work that every human rights defender needs to know. But it's important to carry out that assessment to assess one's own risk and take measures. So if you suspect you might be a victim of abduction, it is important to establish links with local human rights groups. But most importantly, your most immediate family, they need to know about your own personal security plan.
Right.
And take measures to ensure that at least you are protected. If it happens and you suspect that someone has become a victim of abduction, we have a number of human rights mechanisms that we have in the country that we encourage. First, it's important to make a report to the police. In a situation where the situation is politically volatile, try to do it in the company of a lawyer. If you can't afford one, work with local human rights groups who work with such victims.
Right.
And alert the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission which is one of the independent commissions that are put in place by our constitution. Now, these measures are unique, are difficult in circumstances where those institutions are not trusted by victims or families of victims.
Yeah.
So how then do we address it? That's where human rights groups come in, that are legitimate. There are a lot of groups that are mushrooming all over the place, but you need to know groups that are legitimate. The National Transitional Justice Working Group works with a number of human rights groups, and it is hosted by the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO4, which is a coalition of 21 human rights groups. Those are credible groups that you can get in touch with, so that they can help you throughout the process. We also have the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, which is a UN special mechanism. It's a humanitarian mechanism. And the working group does receive reports of enforced disappearances. So families, relatives, and friends who suspect that their member has been abducted can make a direct report to this UN mechanism that we are speaking about. It is not a requirement to exhaust domestic remedies to approach the working group. I have just asked our social media team to share the reporting form for the working group on the platforms for the National Transitional Justice Working Group. But the human rights groups that I also spoke about are available to assist friends, relatives, and families where they think someone has been abducted to make that report. It is not a legal mechanism. It's a humanitarian mechanism by the United Nations. So what the working group then does in response is to get in touch with the foreign ministry of that government through the UN mission in Geneva. And now that means the issue would have been raised in terms of profile. What that does is it is global solidarity to the family that has been affected. Victims of human rights violations, unique, are vulnerable in every sense. They don't have money in most cases. They don't have resources. They don't have the armies. They don't have the military that governments who perpetrate these violations have. So their own currents to respond to such a violation is international solidarity. And the mechanisms like the working group on enforced disappearances are that form of enforced disappearance that families can take advantage of.
Thank you so much, Zikamai, for those key steps. And I'm sure we've all taken note. We will also put contact details of these 21 key organizations, credible organizations that you can reach out to if in any case something like this happens. Justina, talking about transitional justice, and I think this has been a big conversation. How do you move on from forgiving the perpetrators? Where are you now as a victim of, a disappearance and abduction in terms of forgiving the perpetrator? Have they acknowledged that they're wrong? What has been your journey of forgiving been like?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Unique. I think like what Zikamai said, my case went to the courts and the state was found liable. But the people who did this were protected by the state. And the truth has never been said. So there is just speculation. People will ask, but why did they target you? I also speculate that it's probably the work that I was involved in with the Zimbabwe Peace Project. But the truth has never been told. And those people who did this, because if you look at what they were supposed to be doing, there is no job description in government or state institutions that says these people are going to be causing enforced disappearances. There isn't such. So I have not witnessed where they have accounted for what they did, because it was not according to the mandate of the institutions that we recognize.
Right.
And these are all institutions that came together to perpetrate this heinous crime. But at the end of the day, you then say to yourself, does it mean that these perpetrators are actually rewarded rather than being reprimanded?
Yeah.
Because that did not happen. The state just accepted that they were liable, but these individuals never saw their day in court. And I think when we are talking about transitional justice, it's important that the truth be put out there. And there is also an issue of non-recurrence. How can we talk about non-recurrence when people have not been made to account for their actions? So there is a chance that they will continue to repeat this because they are being protected by the state.
Yeah.
And these are some of the things that we are saying. If Zimbabwe really wants to become a democracy, we need to be looking at those things critically and see how we deal with those issues, because the wounds will continue to be there. You know, a wound can have a covering at the top, but it is festering underneath, because there are a lot of things that have not been addressed. Because when we are talking about rehabilitation, this is a process that cannot be done overnight. This is a process that can take years for someone to have to go through. And you cannot go through it on your own, because your family has also been affected. They could actually be small children or the elderly. And the way that they are kind of counseled is different from the way probably someone my age would be counseled. And those facilities are not available for Zimbabweans. And I think it makes it very difficult for people to be able to move on.
Thank you so much, Justina, for that. Lastly, Zikamai, are there any remedies under the law for victims or families of enforced disappearances? I mean, obviously talking about, just going back to what Justina was saying, that these perpetrators were actually protected by the state. And there are different speculations, but I mean, when did this happen?
2008.
Which is almost 12, 15 years ago. And I mean, she still has to deal with the questions of recurrence, possibly recurrence, but at the same time, no one has come to actually acknowledge and say, we're wrong, we're sorry, how do we move on from this? Is there a law that states the protection of victims?
Yeah, we used to have we once had a client at the forum who was a victim, and they were frustrated that our legal system does not seem to offer adequate remedies.
Right.
I mean, we cite that case, as a lighter part, because he then came to the office and said, I think I'm going to use witchcraft on this guy.
Wow.
Now, we don't recommend citizen justice.
Right.
Because it has got all sorts of implications and things like that. But there are some loose mechanisms. First, our criminal law, the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, in Part 5, it creates what are called crimes involving infringement of liberty, dignity, privacy, or reputation. So there are some crimes there so our law does not have the crime of enforced disappearance, but we've got a crime like kidnapping, unlawful detection, or such things that you will find in the criminal code. And if anyone has become a victim of enforced disappearance, it means under criminal law, perpetrators can be charged with this particular crime. But of course, that is assuming that there is enough evidence.
Yes.
And like Justina said, a lot of these perpetrators are protected, and the state has got the mandate to prosecute criminal offenses. You can do private prosecution, but that's a very difficult procedure, and it has not been very successful in our country,
Right.
where the state is unwilling to, which takes us to the third option, which is civil remedies. So suing the state if you have ample evidence in courts, in the court. So like the case of Justina, where Justina was able to go to court and claim damages for a torture and abduction, and the state was convicted and was asked to pay. Whether they then actually pay, whether there is actual value, it's of course another story.
Yeah.
People can also work with local human rights groups that I have mentioned, which should include the national human rights institutions. So we encourage people to approach the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission.
Right.
When I spoke about the mistrust for these institutions, but we can only know that they don't work if we actually try it.
Yes.
So we want to encourage people to be able to approach those institutions, and where they are unable to work, approach human rights groups that can help victims and families to explore possible remedies.
Well, thank you so much. That was Zikamai Bere, who's the National Transitional Justice Working Group Vice Chairperson. And of course, we had Dr. Frances Lovemore, who joined us virtually, and she's the National Transitional Justice Working Group Reparations Committee thematic leader. And of course, we had Justina Mokoko, who's also been a victim of abduction and disappearance, but she's also the Zimbabwe Peace Project director. As of course, today we were commemorating the International Day of Victims of Enforced Disappearances. And at the end of the day, I think we need to work together as a country to make sure that these enforced disappearances do not recur or occur again, so that we can move forward, of course, in terms of transitional justice and fighting against human rights abuses. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, and we'll see you next time.